In the quiet hills of Lynchburg, Virginia, in the modest home of a carpenter's family, a young boy stood transfixed before a picture hanging on the wall. The year was somewhere in the late 1920s. The picture was a framed poster of the 10 Commandments, each commandment illustrated with vivid, unforgettable imagery. But one image haunted young Desmond Doss more than any other. It was the illustration for the 6th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." The image showed Cain standing over his brother Abel, a stone raised in his hand, about to commit the first murder in human history. Desmond stared at that picture and asked himself a question that would shape the rest of his life. What could possibly make a person want to kill their own brother? That day, something crystallized in the heart of this Virginia boy. He made a silent, sacred vow. "I will never take a life." Little did anyone know that this quiet promise, made by a child before a picture on a wall, would one day lead to one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in the history of warfare. This is the story of Desmond Doss, a man who would go to war but refused to carry a weapon, a man who would fight the entire United States Army before he ever faced the Japanese. A man who would prove that the strongest force on a battlefield isn't a rifle, a grenade, or a tank. It's faith, it's conviction, it's the unshakable belief that even in hell itself, you can choose to save rather than destroy. Welcome to the story of the unarmed hero of Hacksaw Ridge. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7th, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, the middle child of 3 siblings. His older sister was Audrey, his younger brother Harold. Their father, William Thomas Doss, was a carpenter who had served in the First World War and worked at a local shoe factory. Their mother, Bertha Oliver Doss, worked at the Craddock Terry Company shoe factory and was a deeply devout woman. This was not a wealthy family. They lived through the Great Depression in the Fairview Heights area of Lynchburg. Young Desmond left school after the 8th grade to work at the Lynchburg Lumber Company, bringing home money to help his struggling family. But poverty couldn't touch the wealth they had in faith. Bertha Doss raised her children as strict Seventh-day Adventists. She instilled in them the sanctity of the Sabbath, which they observed on Saturday, nonviolence, and even vegetarianism. The Doss family attended the Park Avenue Seventh-day Adventist Church, and for Desmond, it wasn't just a Sunday routine. It was the foundation of his entire worldview. But there was another event that cemented Desmond's conviction against violence, one that went beyond the picture on the wall. Desmond's father struggled with alcoholism. One terrible day, there was a violent altercation between William Doss and his brother-in-law. In a drunken rage, William pulled out a gun and pointed at his relative. The situation was seconds away from tragedy. Bertha Doss threw herself in front of the gun. She demanded it from her husband, then pressed it into young Desmond's hands and told him to run and hide it. Desmond took that gun, his hands trembling, and ran. He hid it where it couldn't hurt anyone. In that moment, Desmond vowed never to touch a gun again. These weren't abstract principles for Desmond. They were written in the fabric of his soul. The 10 Commandments weren't suggestions. They were sacred laws. "Thou shalt not kill" meant exactly that. Not in anger, not in self-defense, not in war. Never. By the time Desmond was 21, he had become a deacon at his church. He was a quiet, soft-spoken young man, slender, modest, and unassuming. He didn't smoke. He didn't drink. He didn't curse. He was, by all accounts, everything the United States Army would later consider unsuitable for combat. But then came December 7th, 1941. We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The world changed on that Sunday morning. Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, and America was suddenly thrust into the largest war in human history. Across the nation, young men lined up at recruitment offices. The call to duty was deafening. By early 1941, Desmond Doss was working as a ship joiner at the Newport News Naval Shipyard in Virginia. This was critical defense work, essential to the war effort. Because of this, Desmond was eligible for a draft deferment. He could have stayed home, safe, earning good money, with his conscience intact and his Sabbath protected. But Desmond felt something different stirring in his heart. He later explained, "I felt like it was an honor to serve my country according to the dictates of my conscience." Notice those words, according to the dictates of my conscience, not in violation of his faith, not by compromising his beliefs, but by finding a way to serve that honored both his God and his country. On August 17, 1942, Desmond married Dorothy Pauline Schutte, a young woman from Richmond. It was a beautiful day, full of hope and love, but the shadow of war loomed large. Within weeks, Desmond would have to say goodbye. On April 1st, 1942, Desmond Doss enlisted in the United States Army. He reported to Camp Lee, Virginia, and from there was sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for training with the 77th Infantry Division, the Statue of Liberty Division. His request was simple and to him, entirely reasonable. "I want to be a medic. I will serve. I will go to the front lines, but I will not carry a weapon." The United States Army looked at this skinny, soft-spoken, Seventh-day Adventist from Virginia and thought he had lost his mind. Fort Jackson, South Carolina, was supposed to turn boys into soldiers. For Desmond Doss, it became a crucible of persecution. The 77th Infantry Division drew primarily from the urban areas of New York City. These were tough, street-smart men, many of them older, hardened by life in the city. And then there was Desmond, a young, soft-spoken Southerner with a Virginia drawl who didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't curse, refused to eat meat, and insisted on keeping the Sabbath holy. He was an outsider from day one, but it was his refusal to carry a weapon that turned his fellow soldiers against him. Initially, the 77th had 4 conscientious objectors assigned to it. By the time they were deployed overseas, Desmond was the only one left. The others had transferred out or given up, not Desmond. The harassment began almost immediately. His commanding officers saw him as a liability, a weak link that would get other men killed. His fellow soldiers saw him as a coward. They called him all sorts of names. They mocked his faith. And when Desmond would kneel beside his bunk at night to pray, they threw boots at him. Think about that for a moment. Here was a man who volunteered to serve his country, who could have stayed home safe, kneeling in prayer, and his own comrades threw boots at his head. But Desmond never retaliated. He never complained. He simply picked up the boots, placed them neatly by his bunk, and continued praying. One night, the harassment escalated into violence. Desmond was beaten by his own men in the barracks. When officers investigated, they asked him to identify his attackers. Desmond refused. He wouldn't point a finger at anyone. His commanding officers tried everything to break him. They assigned him extra duties. They denied him leave. They even tried to court-martial him for refusing to carry a weapon. At one point, Desmond was offered a discharge, but it would have been on grounds of mental instability. Desmond refused. "I'm not mentally unstable," he said. "I just want to go to church on the Sabbath." One of his officers told him bluntly, "Doss, you're not a soldier, you're a target." But Desmond had a quiet strength that his tormentors couldn't understand. He later said, "I knew if I ever once compromised, I was going to be in trouble because if you can compromise once, you can compromise again." His strength wasn't in his muscles. He was slight of build, weighing around 140 pounds. His strength was in his soul, in his unshakable conviction that God had called him to save lives, not take them. And he believed something else, something his fellow soldiers didn't understand yet. The world has enough people tearing it apart. It needs someone to put it back together. Eventually, thanks to intervention from his father and support from military regulations protecting conscientious objectors in non-combat roles, Desmond was allowed to serve as a medic with Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division. He was assigned to combat duty without a weapon. In 1944, the 77th Infantry Division shipped out to the Pacific Theater, their destination, some of the most brutal battlefields of World War II. Desmond's first taste of combat came in Guam, followed by the Philippines, particularly the island of Leyte. These were vicious, close-quarters battles against a determined Japanese enemy, fighting from hidden positions in thick jungle terrain. And this is where everything changed for Desmond Doss. When the bullets started flying and the mortars began exploding, when men were screaming, "Medic!" from the jungle floor, Desmond ran toward the fire. While other soldiers took cover, Desmond crawled through the mud and undergrowth, dragging wounded men to safety. He treated their wounds right there in the open, under enemy fire, with bullets zipping past his head. He administered plasma, applied bandages, stopped bleeding, and then often through sheer force of will, he would drag or carry these men to evacuation points. Many of the men he saved were the same ones who had mocked him back at Fort Jackson. Slowly, grudgingly, the attitude toward Desmond began to shift. His fellow soldiers started to realize something. This man would die for them. This man would run into hell itself to bring them out. By the time the 77th Division left the Philippines, Desmond had been awarded 2 Bronze Star medals for exceptional valor. The same men who had thrown boots at him during prayer now sought him out before missions, asking him to pray for them. One soldier later said, "We came to realize that Doss was the best soldier we had. He wouldn't kill, but he'd die saving you." The commanders who once tried to court-martial him now requested him specifically for their units. They knew if you got hit, Doss would come for you. It didn't matter if you were pinned down. It didn't matter if it was daytime or night. It didn't matter if the Japanese were 10 feet away. Doss would come. But nothing could prepare Desmond or his unit for what was coming next. April 1945, the island of Okinawa. This was the gateway to Japan itself. Taking Okinawa meant the Allies could launch a direct invasion of the Japanese homeland. The Japanese knew this, and they were prepared to defend every inch of ground with everything they had. The 77th Infantry Division landed on Okinawa on April 26, 1945. By April 29th, they were moving into position near a place called Urasoe Mura. Their objective? A massive, jagged rock formation rising 400 feet to the air. The Americans called it the Maida Escarpment. The soldiers just called it Hacksaw Ridge. Imagine standing at the base of this cliff. It's not a gentle slope. It's a vertical, jagged rock face. The top 30 to 50 feet form an overhang, impossible to climb. To reach the top, soldiers had to scale cargo nets while carrying full combat gear. And waiting for them at the top were thousands of heavily entrenched Japanese soldiers. The Japanese had spent years fortifying this position. They had dug an intricate network of caves and tunnels into the ridge. They had hidden artillery, machine gun nests, and sniper positions in every conceivable location. They could hit you from above, from the sides, from hidden tunnels beneath your feet. The Japanese called the battle the Rain of Steel because there was so much metal flying through the air at all times. For the American soldiers climbing those cargo nets, it was pure hell. Companies A and B of the 307th Infantry, Desmond's unit, climbed to the top on May 2nd, 1945. For the next several days, the fighting was apocalyptic. Men were cut down in seconds. The ground itself seemed to explode continuously. The smell of sulfur, gunpowder, and death hung in the air like a fog. Desmond moved through this nightmare like a man possessed, not by rage, but by love. Every time a man screamed, "Medic!" Desmond was there, crawling through the chaos, dodging bullets and shrapnel, reaching wounded men, treating them as best he could with his medical kit and dragging them to safety. He worked during the day, but the truly incredible thing, he worked at night too. At night, the battlefield became even more terrifying. You couldn't see the enemy. Every shadow could be a Japanese soldier. Every sound could be your death. The smart thing to do was stay down and wait for dawn, but wounded men were crying out in the darkness, and Desmond couldn't ignore them. One of his fellow soldiers later described it. At night, that's when Desmond done a lot of his work. He'd go out and crawl around amongst our boys and see if they wasn't dead. He'd take care of them, drag them back. He wasn't supposed to do it at night. Officers warned Desmond that he could be shot by friendly fire, that his own men might mistake him for a Japanese soldier in the darkness. Desmond just kept going anyway. Those boys needed his help, and he was there for anyone who was wounded. By May 4th, Desmond had already saved dozens of men. His fellow soldiers, who once called him a coward, now called him a guardian angel. But the worst was yet to come. May 5th, 1945, a Saturday, Desmond's Sabbath. The Japanese launched a massive, coordinated counterattack. It was overwhelming. Thousands of enemy troops poured out of their tunnels and caves, supported by artillery and mortar fire. The Americans were being slaughtered. The order came down the chain of command. Retreat. Evacuate the ridge immediately. The American soldiers scrambled for the cargo nets and rappelled down to safety. One by one, they disappeared over the edge of the cliff. But not everyone made it to the nets. Approximately 75 men lay wounded on top of that ridge, too injured to move, unable to retreat on their own. They were going to be left behind, left to die or be captured by the enemy. And then there was Desmond. The captain of Company B, Jack Glover, looked around and realized Desmond Doss was still up there. He screamed for him to retreat. Desmond refused. Let that sink in. Every trained soldier, armed with rifles, grenades, and the instinct for self-preservation, was fleeing for their lives. And Desmond Doss, unarmed and weighing barely 140 pounds, stayed behind, alone. For the next 12 hours, Desmond became a one-man rescue operation. He would find a wounded man, treat his injuries, then drag or carry him to the edge of the cliff. There he fashioned a rope sling using a special bowline knot. A knot, he later said, came to him as an answer to prayer, one he'd never seen or heard of before in his life. He would secure the wounded man in the sling, then lower him 400 feet down the cliff to medics waiting below. Then he'd pull the rope back up and go find another man. And with every single soldier he saved, Desmond whispered the same prayer. "Lord, please help me get just one more. Just one more." Think about what was happening during those 12 hours. Japanese soldiers were patrolling the area. Artillery shells were still falling. Machine gun fire was still raking across the ridge. Desmond was completely exposed. Any enemy soldier could have shot him at any moment. In fact, one Japanese soldier later recalled having Desmond Doss in his rifle sights, but every time he pulled the trigger, his gun jammed. He tried multiple times, it never fired. One by one, Desmond saved those men, the same soldiers who had thrown boots at him, who had beaten him, who had called him a coward. One by one, he lowered them to safety. One of the men Desmond saved that day was Captain Jack Glover, the same captain who had once doubted him, who had tried to have him transferred out of the unit. When dawn broke on May 6th and American forces retook the ridge, they found Desmond still there, exhausted, his hands torn and bloody from the ropes, his uniform filthy, but alive, and 75 men were alive because of him. Veteran Carl Bentley, who was there, later said, "It's as if God had his hand on his shoulder. It's the only explanation I can give." On May 21st, 1945, 16 days after his heroic rescue, Desmond's unit was involved in a nighttime raid near Shuri. The operation went badly. Japanese forces counterattacked with grenades and small arms fire. Desmond was in a shell hole treating wounded men when a Japanese grenade landed at his feet. The explosion tore through his legs, sending shrapnel deep into his flesh, all the way up to his hip. The pain was excruciating. He could barely move, but there were other wounded men around him. Desmond treated his own wounds as best he could, then continued treating the others. As litter bearers finally arrived to evacuate him, a Japanese sniper's bullet shattered Desmond's left arm. The injury was catastrophic. The bone was pulverized, the tissue destroyed. Even then, even bleeding and in agony, Desmond did something that stunned everyone present. When the litter bearers reached him, he ordered them to take another more critically wounded soldier first. He crawled off his own stretcher, lay on the ground, and waited 5 hours for the medics to return for him. This is who Desmond Doss was. Even when facing death himself, he put others first. Desmond was evacuated to the USS Mercy and eventually sent back to the United States for treatment. The bullet had destroyed his arm so badly that doctors initially considered amputation. Through multiple surgeries, they managed to save the arm, but Desmond would never have full use of it again. But there was more. During his treatment, doctors discovered that Desmond had contracted tuberculosis, likely from the cold, wet, sleepless nights spent in muddy foxholes on Pacific Islands. The disease ravaged his lungs. Over the next several years, Desmond underwent extensive medical treatment. Surgeons had to remove his left lung entirely, along with 5 ribs. For the rest of his life, Desmond Doss survived on a single lung. Later, in 1976, an overdose of antibiotics left him completely deaf. It would take a cochlear implant in 1988 to restore his hearing. The war had taken an immense physical toll on this gentle man who refused to hurt anyone. A modest, soft-spoken corporal from Virginia stood in his dress uniform, his left arm still bandaged and healing. Around him stood 14 other Medal of Honor recipients, but Desmond was different from all the others. President Harry S. Truman stepped forward, the Medal of Honor in his hands. He draped the blue ribbon around Desmond's neck, and then he did something that stunned everyone present. President Truman took Desmond's hand in both of his and shook it warmly, like greeting an old friend. Truman looked Desmond in the eyes and said, "I consider this a greater honor than being president." Desmond Doss had become the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. Of the 16 million men who served in uniform during World War II, only 431 received the Medal of Honor. Desmond was the only one who earned it without ever firing a shot. Throughout these quiet years, Desmond never sought fame. He spoke at churches and schools when asked, always giving credit to God for his survival and his courage. He worked with Seventh-day Adventist scouting programs, teaching young people about faith and service. In 2004, filmmaker Terry Benedict released a documentary about Desmond's life called The Conscientious Objector. It brought renewed attention to his incredible story. Then on March 23, 2006, Desmond Doss died at his home in Piedmont, Alabama. He was 87 years old. He had been hospitalized for difficulty breathing, his single lung finally giving out after all those years. Desmond was buried with full military honors at Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee on April 3, 2006. Hundreds attended his funeral. Veterans, church members, people whose lives he had touched. They came to pay their respects to a man who proved that you don't need a weapon to be a warrior. Francis Doss passed away 3 years later, on February 3, 2009. Desmond Doss left behind a legacy that continues to inspire people around the world. In 1951, while Desmond was still alive, Camp Desmond T. Doss was established in Grand Ledge, Michigan, a training facility for young Seventh-day Adventist men entering military medical service. The camp operated through the Korean and Vietnam Wars. In the early 1980s, a school in his hometown of Lynchburg was renamed Desmond T. Doss Christian Academy, founded by the Park Avenue Seventh-day Adventist Church, the same church where young Desmond once gazed at the picture of Cain and Abel. On July 10, 1990, a section of Georgia Highway 2 was named the Desmond T. Doss Medal of Honor Highway. In 2007, a bronze statue of Desmond, depicted in uniform and saluting, was unveiled at Veterans Memorial Park in Collegedale, Tennessee. But perhaps the most powerful tribute came in 2016, when director Mel Gibson released the film Hacksaw Ridge, starring Andrew Garfield as Desmond Doss. The film was a massive critical and commercial success, winning 2 Academy Awards. Andrew Garfield was nominated for Best Actor. The film brought Desmond's story to a whole new generation. Millions of people who had never heard of the unarmed hero of World War II. Interestingly, the real story was so incredible that the filmmakers actually toned down certain elements because they feared audiences wouldn't believe them. Mel Gibson later said that if he had shown everything Desmond actually did, people would have thought it was Hollywood exaggeration. Think about that. The true story was so extraordinary that even Hollywood couldn't fully capture it. Today, Desmond Doss is remembered as a man of unwavering principle, a man who proved that courage comes in many forms, that you can be a conscientious objector and still be the bravest person on the battlefield. His story reminds us of something profound. In a world obsessed with power and violence, sometimes the most revolutionary act is to refuse to kill. What do we take away from the story of Desmond Doss? First, that conviction matters. In a world that constantly pressures us to compromise, to go along with the crowd, to bend our principles for convenience or acceptance, Desmond shows us that standing firm on your beliefs, even when everyone thinks you're crazy, is worth it. He could have accepted that discharge and gone home. He could have compromised just this once and picked up a weapon. He could have blamed his injuries on his superiors and quit, but he didn't, because he understood that if you compromise once, you can compromise again. Second, that real strength isn't about domination, it's about sacrifice. Desmond was physically small, soft-spoken, and refused to carry a weapon. By every conventional measure, he should have been the weakest man on that battlefield. Instead, he became the strongest, not because he could destroy, but because he could endure, because he was willing to run into fire to save others, because he valued every human life, even the lives of men who had beaten and mocked him. Third, that faith can move mountains, or in Desmond's case, save 75 men on a ridge. Whether you share Desmond's religious beliefs or not, his story proves the power of having something larger than yourself to believe in, something worth suffering for, worth dying for. Desmond's prayer, "Lord, please help me get just one more," wasn't just a request for divine intervention. It was a manifestation of his entire philosophy of life. Focus on the one person in front of you. Do what you can for them, then move to the next one. Finally, Desmond's story reminds us that history is made by ordinary people who refuse to accept that things must be the way they've always been. Everyone told Desmond that you can't be a good soldier without carrying a weapon. Everyone told him he would get himself killed. Everyone told him to quit. And Desmond, in his quiet, humble way, proved them all wrong. The world didn't need another man with a gun on Hacksaw Ridge. It needed a man with compassion, with courage, with an unshakable commitment to preserve life rather than destroy it. Today, Desmond Doss rests in Chattanooga National Cemetery. His Medal of Honor is displayed at the National Museum of the United States Army. His story has been told in books, documentaries, and films. But the real legacy of Desmond Doss isn't in the accolades or the monuments. It's in the 75 men who came home from Okinawa because one unarmed medic refused to leave them behind. It's in their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, entire family trees that exist because Desmond Doss believed in the sanctity of every single human life. In a war that claimed over 60 million lives, in a battle that the Japanese called the Rain of Steel, on a ridge where death fell from the sky every second, one man proved that the greatest weapon isn't the one that takes life, it's the one that saves it. Thank you for taking this journey with us through the extraordinary life of Desmond Doss. If this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it reminded you that one person with unshakable conviction can change the world, please share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that standing up for what's right is worth it, even when you stand alone. Share it with someone who thinks they're too weak, too small, too different to make a difference. Share it with someone who has forgotten that heroes don't always carry weapons. Sometimes they carry stretchers. And remember, the greatest strength isn't the courage to fight. It's the courage to stay true to who you are, even when the whole world is against you. God bless Desmond Doss. May we all have just a fraction of his courage,